I'm Dean Savola, and this is the Azure Academy. In our last video, we ended with quite the cliffhanger. We had built out our environment in the portal, and we were ready to capture that data and start to automate the entire process end to end. And that's the ultimate goal here. So when you're dealing with stuff in the cloud, the only way to scale, and I mean really scale, I mean massive scale, where you can be handling an entire global environment full of tens of thousands of systems and resources. The only way to really handle this is with automation. Okay, and the reason for that is just the sheer volume. I mean, we have only so many people who can do so many things, but the more we can automate every step of our processes, especially around deployments, that will make our lives much, much easier, and we can enable things like user self-service, empower our users with standard configurations that we've come up with that meet all of our criteria, and they just have to fill in a couple simple parameters, and boom, they've got a whole environment that's certified for use, and they can get to what they're supposed to do and increase value. Okay, so with that in mind, let's jump over to the Azure portal, and we're going to go under our deployments, and let's look at what we've got. And we could click on each one of these, and we could capture the templates, and we could make a bunch of templates from all of this, and we could capture all those inputs, and then we could process them one at a time. So, okay, build the first template, wait for that to be done, then build the second template, and wait for that to be done, and then the third one, and load balancer, and then, well, wait, how do we configure the load balancer? Because this just gave us a default load balancer with none of the other things that we actually need. And boy, how do we do this? And then what about this extension thing? So while this may seem very, very complicated, and to a degree it is, we also kind of make it a little easier for you with this automation script button. So let me move these windows a little bit. So here is the JSON to deploy everything that is currently deployed in this resource group. And when we look at the load balancer, see it's got the front end, it's got the back end, load balancing rules, it's got the probe. So this looks pretty great. Now we could download all of this right now, but we're not going to download it. Instead, we're going to open Visual Studio. So when we open Visual Studio and you start a new project, what you get is a Azure deploy file and Azure deploy.parameters file. And they're basically blank. You just have the framework of the JSON document. Now, specifically, the reason why I prefer to use Visual Studio as opposed to any other editor for JSON, for specifically ARM templates, is because of all of the helpful benefits that it gives me. Now, there are many other editors. Like here is an editor called CodeWriter, and you can download this from the Windows Store, and it will definitely edit JSON documents for you, kind of like a notepad would, and you can go through here and write all your code. It's not going to do IntelliSense. It's not going to give you a lot of benefits beyond just being able to type your code. So I like to use that to read code sometimes, but not actually to edit and create code. Another option that's pretty popular these days is VS Code. Now, VS Code is used in a variety of platforms, and it's an open source version of Visual Studio that is very community driven. So there's lots of add-ons and extensions, but it also has quite the learning curve, and you've got to figure out how to use this tool. It's not one that I'm very comfortable with yet, so I'm not going to be able to edit my ARM templates in the same way, but you could definitely do it, and I'm sure based on the extensions that you have in it, it will do a lot of things for you, and that would be very helpful. However, some of the things that I find to be extremely helpful when it comes to Visual Studio is this JSON outline. It helps me to get around the document, helps me to know where I'm going, what I'm looking at, and let me walk you through some of that. Now we have our code in the portal, and all of this code, we could just copy it all, and we could go into Visual Studio, and we could highlight and delete everything here and paste, and now we've got all our resources here, and we can just start editing from here. And if I've done this in the past, and it does take quite a long time, but the benefit is all the code is here. Now, if you understand what everything is doing, this could be pretty fast because you built something in the portal. It's exactly how you want it. You drop the code into here, you make some quick edits, and you're done. But let me show you the end state. Okay, this is what I transformed all of this code, and take note of the outline here. Okay, this is what I translated all of this code, 641 lines of code that we got out of the portal, and there's the outline, and this is what I did with it by the time I was done. Much more human readable. We cut out about 200 lines of code, and what we did is we made this very dynamic. Okay, so when I go to do a deployment, I right click on the project name and we go to do a deployment. And what happens here when we do that is it looks up our identity on Azure, figures out if we have a subscription, how many subscriptions we have, what resource groups are currently available, and then it brings in your code. Now, here is the code that we got straight out of Azure. Now, if I hit edit parameters here, this is what the user would be presented with. Okay, now user, you figure it out. Okay, you've got these names and they're named for building specifically a web server, and then you've got some things like this web VM ID. I don't know what this number is. I don't know what to do with this. So it's kind of confusing for a user. The end goal that we want to get to is a very simplified experience for a user. Okay, and so I've got it here set to build multiple tiers of a system, multiple sizes, Windows or Linux from the same template, and then I'm giving it a extension that's going to install that web server role. Okay, and the argument here, this is actually a space because there's a parameter here for the argument. I could actually remove that, but I left it here in case any other scripts that you would want to do in the future require arguments. And I'm also saying, by the way, that I'm going to build 2 web servers. I could make this 4, and now we're building 4. So this is the end state that we want to get to, which our template here is what we want to get. Okay, and with this end state in mind, we're going to get rid of all of this, and we're going to start with the blank, and we're going to build up to this. Okay, so we're going to use our portal here as a reference when it comes to building our assets so that we know we're building them correctly to spec. But Visual Studio is going to be a big help, and we're going to start with 2 things. First is we have to have a plan, and we have to know what it is we're going to present to the user, what are the user inputs or the parameters that are going to go in this section, and then we're going to have to plan what resources we're building, what is the scope of this particular template, of this environment, or however large you're going to make this. Now, along with that, there's a few things that we need to look up so that we know where these are for our future reference, and that would be in the Azure documentation and in the references section of the Azure Resource Manager, and that would be the template functions. Now, template functions are what is going to enable us to be able to do a lot more. See, what we could do, and I'll just show you this rather quickly here, you can right-click and add resources, and when you do, you say build a Windows virtual machine, and we'll just call this test something, and then we'll create a storage account with some number, and then we'll create a new virtual network with some number. And there you go. Okay, boy, we added that. Now let's add another one. And we'll say that this is another Windows virtual machine, and we'll call this test2 something, and use that same thing. And we'll use this same thing. Okay, great. So now we've added a couple virtual machines. Whole lot of code on here. Doesn't look very nice and neat, but hey, we've got it done. Now, in order to scale from this to this, we need a bunch of functions. Now, functions are going to be things that are opening with a square bracket and then have some name, open parenthesis, close parenthesis. That is a function. And the functions are all found in the documentation. And there's all different kinds for manipulating objects and arrays, comparative functions, functions just related to deployment, logic, if, then, not, or, etc., numeric functions, functions related to resources, and then string functions, etc. So a whole lot of stuff that's here, and we're going to use a lot of it. So just wanted you to know this is where I'm finding all of this. So if I pull up a function and I'm using it and you're like, I don't understand, where'd you get that? What's that do? So here's a good one, concat. So the concat function combines multiple arrays and it returns them as a concatenated array. So what does that mean in English? So inside here, if we concat, we're going to concat another function called parameter and the first array. So it's parameter first array. So that's this guy. Okay, so that means this stuff is what we're looking at. And then we're going to combine that with parameter second array, which is this stuff. So what do we get from that? We would get this. Okay, so it combines all that information. Now let's take a look at another function here. And this is one for resource groups. Now the resource group function has a lot of things that it can do. One of them is where you can, as we've seen in past videos, where you can specify the location of a resource group. You can do the name, you can do a whole bunch of other things, and here they all are. Okay, and that's how you would find what a function can do. You look in the documentation and you read that if you use a resource group function, that here's all the different stuff that it will do for you. Okay, a bunch of examples of how it's written out in the code. Okay, so with that, I'm going to undo all of this and undo all of this. Okay, so now we're starting clean. So now that we've gotten the documentation out of the way and everything I'm doing is going to have its roots in the documentation, we need a plan. And the plan is, what are we building? So for this, we know what we're building, and it was based on our deployment. We want 2 web servers, a load balancer, public IP address, a network, and we want them to be highly available. So based on that, we need some inputs. So what do we want the user to have to answer in order to get that? So one of the things that we want is to also make this more extensible. We want to use this past one scenario of building web servers. We want to be able to build web servers, app servers, database servers, and then we also, later on in our next video, will actually combine them so we can provision all 3 tiers at once. So we'll scale up beyond what we're going to do today. But for right now, in order to build web, app, or DB servers, we have to make something in our parameter that's going to tell the user that you're building a web server and give them the option of building a web server and an app server and a DB server, etc. So to do that, we're going to create a parameter. The syntax of the templates when you go to write the language always starts off with double quotes. And in here, we're going to make name value pairs. And sometimes we'll be building blocks, arrays, etc. So the name of this is going to be the tier because we're building a specific tier. And then inside here, every parameter must have a type that is required. And you can find this all in the documentation. And then anything beyond just type are optional. So I'm going to add some other things because we want to have the user select what thing they're building. And that'll be our allowed values. Now, allowed values shows us the next kind of object, and that is this. It opens with square brackets. This is an array. So an array could either be a bunch of things that have single quotes, like what we're going to do here. And this is going to be web, app, database. That is an array, and that's what the user will select when they go through this. Another one that we're going to throw in here is a default value. And the default value means the very first thing that will be in the box, and it will be the thing that is chosen if the user does not make another choice. Okay, so when the user goes to deploy, the tier name box will have in it web. And then they will have the option through a drop-down to select DB, or app. So let me show you what that looks like. So to do a deployment, we will right click on our project name and go to deploy, go to new. And what Azure is doing here is a lookup for us to figure out our identity, what subscriptions we have access to, what resource groups we have access to, and then we select our resource group, in this case our AA Web Demo, and then we have our template and our parameters, which are all found over here. Now, the other one that's in the folder, that's listed here with the folder name, and then it has the templates. Same thing for the parameters. So this is the one we're working on now, so I'll hit Edit Parameters so you can see what our inputs would look like. There we go. We have a drop-down menu where we can select the specific value that we want. So let's select Database, and we'll hit Save. Now when we hit Save, that information is saved into the parameters file found over here, tier name, database. Okay? So now, the next time you run this deployment, it will already be set with the value that was in the parameters file. Okay, so that way you can iterate through your deployments rather quickly, and it also means that you could have separate parameters files for separate deployments. Here's the deployment for my web environment. Here's the one for my database environment. Okay? So for right now, let's get back to some of this. Now, once you are done creating whatever that parameter is with all of its little values and everything else, at the end of that, there needs to be a comma so that you can put in the next parameter. So the next parameter we're going to need is how many of these things are we building? So we'll create an instance number. Now this is going to give us another kind of parameter, and this type is going to be an integer. So a string is numbers and letters, an integer is only numbers. Now we're also going to set here minimum and maximum values so that we know we have to always deploy one, and we can deploy a maximum of whatever you want. In this case, I'll just say 4, but it could easily be 400, 4,000, whatever you want. Okay, whatever your subscription limits are. Now, I will also create here a default, whoops, already did that. Let's do a default value. And you notice how the default value already gives us double quotes. Now, if I put a 1 there, the template would recognize this as a string. Okay, it would not be recognized as an integer. So to make it an integer, we actually do not use the double quotes. Leave it like that. Okay, so that's done. Now, what other things do we want to have the user specify? So we have the number of systems that we're going to build. We have the tier that we're going to build. Another one could be virtual machine size. Okay, so what we've done here is we've created a size string, and it's going to have a default value of standard F2S_V2. That's a size I like to use for basic compute. And then we're having other values of B1MS and D2. So these are the allowed values, and we could change these to be anything we liked, but we'll leave that for now. Now, what's another thing that we need? How about an admin username and password? And notice we use another type here of secure string. That's what's going to give us the dots as we do our deployment. Okay, so now we've got a database that we can pick from, a size we can pick from, a username, and then a password, which is secure. Now, this is another option that we can do, because remember, if you just enter a password here, it's secure, so it won't be stored in the parameters file. There is, however, a way to store it securely in the parameters file, and that's by clicking the button, and we look up a key vault, and we select the value of the secret that's there. Okay, so now if we look at our parameters file, now it's got our database name, our username, and this reference for my key vault, and the key vault is using the secret name called default password. And let me show you what that looks like in the portal. So here in our Azure Academy resource group, we open our key vault, and then in the key vault, we go to secrets, and the secret has a default password. And if you have the rights in the key vault, then you can see the value of it. And there's the value. Now, don't bother copying it. Don't bother trying to use it because it's just a gibberish string of numbers, and I have mechanisms that reset the password on my systems once they're deployed. So good luck. Anyway, there's one more thing in the key vault when you build it that you need to check so that you can use this, and that is the access policies. So here's me, and then up here it says click to show advanced access policies. And then you would check these boxes to allow virtual machines to be accessed of the Key Vault for deployment and to use them in Resource Manager templates. And another one here to enable Azure Disk Encryption. Okay, we're not going to do that one right now, but we'll come back to it in another video. So that's what the Key Vault does. And let's get back to our deployments. So now we've got a parameter for admin password, username, VM size, the instance, and the tier name of what we're going to deploy. Some other things that you should think about are we going to provision networks with our VMs, or are we going to have existing networks? Okay, now here's a way that you can use this. So let me go here and add resource, and I'll just show you what this looks like for a VM. So if we say here, select from subscription, it's going to do a lookup, find all of our subscriptions, all the virtual networks, and then we can just select a virtual network to use for our deployment. Okay, so let's pick this one, and we'll say web, we'll hit OK, and then we'll just add our VM here that we'll delete in a second, and we'll say a storage account. And we'll say our Azure Academy storage account, and we'll hit add. And see, of course, it added all of this code for us, yay, but the thing that we're looking for is here, our virtual network ID. So this value is what you need if you're going to deploy to existing virtual networks. You need to make a reference to the virtual network ID and the particular subnet because the network card requires that. Okay, because the network card has to be built on a subnet. So you would need these two lines or something like that to make reference to an existing subnet. So let me get rid of all of that. And if you're going to build it right here in your template, then you don't have to worry about that because you'll just be referencing it within the template itself. Now, what other input parameters should we have? Now, if you are in a multi-OS environment, you'd want to be able to choose between your different operating systems, like Windows or different flavors of Linux. So let's add a parameter for that. Okay, so we've added an operating system string with the default value of Windows, and you can choose Windows or Linux. Now, based on this, we need some other stuff, because just saying Windows or Linux is not enough to deploy a system. So looking at our portal, here's our VM, and when you choose Windows in the portal and you pick Server 2016, it makes this reference inside the VM build. And if you do that for Linux, there'll be different information here. So we have to capture that information and bring it into our template so that when we choose Windows, this is the system we get. And if we have Linux, then there's other values here. So let's go back and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, in our variables section, I've created a variable called VM_images, and here is what it looks like inside. So inside, it makes reference to Windows and Linux, just like our parameter. So when the user selects Windows, it'll use this Windows block, and when they select Linux, it'll use this Linux block. And inside each of those, we have the values that were necessary based on what we found in the portal. And I also went through and just did a Linux build so I could grab that information as well. And now we have the specific OS version from the marketplace that we want to deploy with. Great, so now we've got Windows, Linux available to us. We just have to pipe that information into our VM, which we'll do in a moment. Now, the only other thing that we incorporated into our final example which I had shown you here, was around the file URI and the argument. That related to our extension. We're going to leave that off for the moment, and we're going to call this particular section good to go. And here's what it looks like. So now the user experience is pick a size, pick a count, pick a particular VM size, give me the admin name. The password is already going to be specified for us from this key vault lookup, so we don't have to worry about knowing the password, and we can choose Windows or Linux. Okay, so that's our build so far. There's what our parameters file looks like. So based on this information, we can now plug in the different stuff in the resources that we're going to need in order to provision this particular environment that's going to give us a tier, a single tier, either web, app, or DB, and it's going to build the servers, and then it's going to build the network cards. And we have the choice of, are we going to build a virtual network or part of this? We will. And then we'll add on after that things like the load balancer and public IP address and all that. So let me provision all of this here in the template, and then I'll walk you through what we've got. Okay, so here's what we have so far. We've built a virtual network, availability set, a network card, and virtual machine. And it looks really nice and neat. Now, let me show you some of these things. So you've already seen all of our parameters. They have not changed. And here is our variables section. So I added a few things. So we have the virtual network and subnet reference for where we're going to be provisioning this. And then I have a virtual machine name that I added. And you notice I've used a concat function and a parameters function. So we're taking our tier name and we're going to concat that with the word VM. Okay, then we have our image reference for Windows or Linux, and now let's jump into some of the resources. So first thing that we want to look at is that reference to the operating systems that we talked about, and that's in our virtual machine. So if we open that up inside the virtual machine properties, we have the storage profile and the image reference. Now, this looks a little complex, so let me walk you through this. Okay, so we're making a reference here to the variable of VM images, and that's up here. And then we're saying the parameter of operating system, which is Windows or Linux. Okay, so the user will select Windows or Linux, and so we're saying pick the VM images variable, either Windows or Linux based on the user input, and then we do a .select of the publisher. So in this case, Microsoft Windows Server would be in here if we selected Windows, and SUSE would be here if we selected Linux. And then you go down the line, and we have our offer, our SKU, and our version, and each of these particular objects would get put into this line. If we selected Windows, we would get this. If we selected Linux, we would get this. Okay, so let's look at some other resources. So our virtual network currently has a static name, and we can make this more dynamic if we want to, but right now it's static. And then we have a few different things that are necessary for each kind of resource. That is a type, and the type tells the system what type of resource it is, and this is a virtual network. And you notice here our availability set is a different type. Now, this first part of the type is the provider. And the provider for many different types is Microsoft.network or Microsoft.compute. And you can see here our VM and our availability set are compute resources. And then our network interface card and our virtual network are network resources, as well would be our load balancer and our public IP address. So with that understanding that every resource must have a type, then from there we have a name. Every resource must have a name. Then we have the API version. This is a very important part of each deployment type because the API version is going to give us the different options that are inside the resource. For example, API version here for this availability set, okay? That is when we announced or when we deployed managed disk. And managed disk availability sets are different than unmanaged disk availability sets, and they're distinguished by this SKU that is aligned. When they are aligned, you're using managed disk. So if we use an older API than this SKU type would be invalid, and the system wouldn't know what to do with it. But anything beyond this date, and we know that we have a proper API version. So how do we find them? Well, IntelliSense is our friend. So here's the latest API version for availability sets. So let's use that. And it will definitely be aware of our SKU type. Then we have a location. And the location specifies the location of this particular resource. Some resources must be in the same region as other resources. Like you can't have a virtual machine in West inside an availability set in East. They have to be together. Same thing with the virtual network and the virtual machine. The virtual machine cannot be on a network that's in East if it lives in West. Okay, they have to be together. Now, other things here that are optional. These are tags. The tag is a way to add metadata to each resource. The tag display name is what gives me the nice, neat name here. So if I took this tag of display name away from our availability set, you can see the name changes to what is in the name construct. Okay, so to keep this generic, because the name could definitely change over time, we keep a display name tag. You can add any other tag you like. Tags are name value pairs. So we could add a tag called the cost center and then have a value of, I don't know, HC, there you go. It doesn't matter what it is, it's just a name value pair. It could be any name, any value that means something to you in your environment. Tags are a great way to keep track of resources. Who owns them? Who's paying for them? What environment do they belong to? What application do they belong to? The sky is the limit. So whatever you want your tags to be, you can create them and add them to your resources here. Now, before we come to the copy, we'll look at some other stuff. So this is the properties block, and you notice the properties for each resource type are very, very different. It's because they have different requirements. Okay, so a properties block is totally unique to that resource. Now the DependsOn block, you can see these are blank. That means that these two resources do not depend on anything. They can just be provisioned. Not so for our virtual machine. Our virtual machine has two things that it depends on: the network card and the availability set. So both of those resources have to be built first. Then the virtual machine can build. Okay, so by putting this in the DependsOn block, and I'll explain what these copies are in a second, by putting them here, it says the virtual machine must wait to be built until the network card and the availability set are built first. Now, this brings up a good problem because our network card currently does not have any dependencies. Now, can we provision our network card before our network exists? No, we cannot. The network must exist first, so we need to add a dependency here. Now, there's two ways of doing it. Find that inside the portal, and there is the resource ID for the virtual network, or you could find it under the properties of the virtual network, is just put the whole ID right there as well. The problem with doing this is that this makes it static. It can only be deployed to this subscription, to this resource group, to a virtual network with this name. The other way to do it, we could use our variable that we have, because remember, we are making a reference already. So we could do that because our reference of a VNet ID is already doing this lookup. But that, again, is limited to this resource group, to this virtual network name. We could variabilize these more, but for now, we're going to leave that alone. So the way that I've done it, when I've incorporated things into the same template like this, that I want to make dependencies, I want them easy to reference, and I want to be able to multiply them, is the copy block. Now in copy, there's two required parameters, and that is name and count. So I've made a copy block name of vnet-copy, which we will put here. This means that the virtual network must wait until the vnet copy is complete. VNet copy will be complete after it builds one virtual network. I could say 4, 50, 100, however many you want, up to your resource limits. Now, there's other ways to make reference to this. So let me show you what that looks like, and we'll do that here in our network cards copy block. See, I've referenced as the count the instance number that the user puts in. Now, for you to remember, the instance count is an integer which says between 1 and 4 systems can be built. When you select 4, the network card will provision 4 network cards. So that's why in our name here, we have this function, copy index. That tells the system you're doing a copy block, and inside the copy, you're first going to build 0. Okay, then 1, 2, 3. That's your 4 count, 0, 1, 2, 3. So when it's going to do that, it's going to pick the variable of virtual name and combine that with the number, whatever count we're on, and then combine that with -nic. So our virtual name is a variable, and that gets its name from the tier and VM. So if we pick the tier of web, this name would be web VM, and the NIC would be called web VM 0-NIC. And the virtual machine would be called web VM 0. Okay, because we're not putting anything after the copy block. Okay, so that's how the copy function works. And then there are other ways of doing copy instances. For example, I'll show you this one just for a reference. We're not actually going to use it here. See how I have in our variables section, I have the VM images, and in there is Windows and Linux. Now, inside VM images, there are 2 items. Now, I can reference that in my copy block by saying another function called length. And the length would be the variable of VM images. Now, this is not a direct example. This would work. We would get 2 because there are 2 items here. Okay, so if you are creating arrays worth of objects for references, like you're going to build multiple backup vaults, and you're going to list them in your variables array so you can reference them, and you have a backup vault array full of 40 vaults, then when you do this function written this way for your backup vaults, you would build 40 of them. Okay, so that's just another way to do that. So if you have an array of things, you can do a length, and if you have an integer, you can just reference the integer here like I'm doing. So based on all of that, we should be able to now deploy this template, and we should get however many systems we want out of this. So let's do a deployment. Put this in the AA web demo, and this time we will build app servers, and we will build 4 of them. And let's build that. Okay, so our deployment has finished successfully. Let's go over to the portal, and here they are. So we've got our app availability set with our 4 OS disks, and then we've got our 4 NIC cards and our 4 VMs that are our app servers. So all in all, this was a success. Now we can continue to build this out from here, and we certainly will over our next video. So we'll continue to build this out, add our load balancer, add our public IP address, and then from there we're going to scale it up to multiple tiers and then get those extensions working. So hope this has helped you to start writing your templates. Remember that you need a plan. You need to understand your functions. What are your requirements? What is your environment? Will you have networks already in place? Do you have to provision them as you provision your VMs, or will they already be existing? Same thing with your availability sets, storage accounts, and all other resources that you will require. Do your planning. Figure out what it is that you're going to do. If you're unsure of what to do or how to build it first in the portal, and then look at the automation script. And I'll give you one last tip here. If it's too confusing looking through this, figuring out where does my resource stop and start, under all services, you will find the Resource Explorer. And that is down here at the bottom. And I star it and I keep it on my sidebar here. And inside the Resource Explorer, we've looked at this in the past, you can find your specific resource group and your specific resources. And then you can look up those resources so that you have just that in view, so that you know exactly what it is that it needs, and that you can reference here if looking at the other view is too confusing to figure out everything that particular resource requires for you to build it. Okay, so I hope this has been a help to you, and we will see you in the next video where we're going to continue to build out this template and scale from there. We'll see you next time.